Hello, and welcome to tonight's program, Return to the Reich, a Holocaust refugee's secret mission to defeat the Nazis, with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Eric Lichtblau. This event is sponsored by the Learning Center, or TLC, the Adult Education Committee at Channing Memorial Church here in Newport, Rhode Island. I'm Susan Kuronsky, Committee Chair. As most of you know, Channing is a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Our humanistic spiritual focus leads us to be curious about many topics and committed to important causes. Since we're meeting virtually, we can't ask for in-person donations to help defray the cost of bringing you future programs. We do encourage and appreciate free will gifts to the church's general fund, though, and you can now donate directly through the Channing website. Tim Phelps, also from TLC, will now give us some more background on our speaker. Tim?
Thanks, Susan. Eric was born in Syracuse, New York in 1965 and went to Cornell University. Somehow, he landed a prestigious internship at the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau after college. And then when that was over, he was good enough that he was hired on the local staff in Los Angeles, working mainly in the Orange County Bureau and doing investigative work. In 1999, he was promoted back to the Washington Bureau as the Justice Department correspondent. And he did that for 3 years before he was hired by the New York Times to do the same beat. He was there at the New York Times until 2017, winning a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage with fellow LA Times alumnus Jim Risen of the NSA wireless wiretapping after 2011. And he was also part of the Pulitzer team at the Times that won in 2017 for the coverage of Russian interference in the presidential election. Among his books are Bush's Law, The Remaking of American Justice, that came out in 2009 on the war on terror, and also covered the government's attempts to block his stories on the NSA scandal from appearing in the Times. He is working on a new book about hate crimes and white supremacy. He lives in the Maryland suburbs of Washington with his wife and 4 children, and plays tennis, and apparently from his Facebook account is a skier as well. Eric, take it away. Or thank you, Susan. It's about the changes in the law after 2000 and after the attacks in 2001, as well as the attempts to squelch his story on the NSA. Eric lives in the Washington, D.C. area, outside of D.C., with his wife and 4 children. He's an avid tennis player, and according to what I see on Facebook, a skier as well. He has a new book coming out in not the too distant future on hate crimes and white supremacy. So, Eric, take it away.
Well, thank you, Tim, very much, and thank you, Susan and Channing, for inviting me here tonight. Nice to see you all, even virtually, and it's a little warmer inside here than probably where some of you are in the Northeast. But I am happy to talk about my my latest book, which, as you heard, is called "Return to the Reich: A Holocaust Refugee's Secret Mission to Defeat the Nazis." I'll show you some photos in a little bit from that. The main character in the book, this book of nonfiction, is someone you probably never heard of, named Freddie Mayer. And I had never heard of him myself until about 5 or 6 years ago, but I'm certainly very glad that I did, because I think that his story really is an inspirational war story that says a lot in modern times about heroism, about the contributions of immigrants to our society, and about the greater fight against fascism that he and so many others waged in World War II against the Nazis. So as I said, I had never heard of Freddie until almost by chance. I was meeting with a source for coffee in 2016, and I had just written another World War II book called The Nazis Next Door, about all the thousands of Nazis who had gotten into America after the war. And I was meeting with a source who was at the Justice Department, hunting Nazis for years and years. He's still at the Justice Department, a man by the name of Eli Rosenbaum, who's done phenomenal work in that area, rooting out Nazis who got into America. And I remember on my way in on the subway, back when I was actually taking the subway to work before COVID, I had read an obituary about a figure, a man in Europe who had died after being credited with helping to save countless people, Jews and others, during the Holocaust. And I was somewhat embarrassed that I'd never heard of this man. It was a Schindler's List type person, but without quite the Steven Spielberg notoriety. And I remember saying to Eli, how is it that we have all these phenomenal, incredible stories of bravery and heroism from the war, and these people die in relative anonymity, without. I had just written a book on the subject, for crying out loud, and I had never heard of this guy. And I said to him, these people were in their early 90s at that point. Now the survivors are in their mid 90s, late 90s, if they're alive at all. Tell me someone I'm going to wish I could meet right now who's still alive before I have to read about their story in an obituary. Who are these people that are still living and breathing and amongst us? And he knew immediately someone to suggest, and that was Freddie Mayer. And not only was Freddie still alive and kicking and in phenomenally good shape then at the age of 94 years old, but he lived, in fact, just outside Washington in West Virginia, only about 90 miles away. And Eli told me the story. There was a movement then afoot, which is why he thought of Freddie in response to my question, to get him a Medal of Honor 70 plus years after the war, which had been denied to him for really bureaucratic reasons. And to this day, he still never got the Medal of Honor. But he told me Freddie's story of having fled Nazi Germany as a teenager with his family, being among the lucky few, the relative few, to get out and get into America and get sort of the golden ticket of a visa into America, and then settling in Brooklyn, as did many Jewish families who did make it into the United States in that time. And then after the war started, after Pearl Harbor, after the US entered the war, volunteering very quickly, not as quickly as he could. He wanted to be in the next day, and they wouldn't let him, but to enlist, and eventually getting the opportunity to be a US spy and parachute back into Austria, into Nazi-held territory in the Austrian Alps, on behalf of this fledgling new spy agency called OSS, the Office of Special Services, and perform this series of just unbelievable escapades, to the point that he was sending back cables with incredible intelligence value to the United States about what was going on on Italy's northern front, near the Brenner Pass, northern Italy, where some of the harshest fighting towards the end of the war was going on, and even in Hitler's own bunker. He was sending back cables about that. He did his job so well that the Nazis were soon on the lookout for him. And he was, unfortunately, was actually captured and tortured for days and days. And through another unbelievable bit that you wouldn't quite believe was true as opposed to Hollywood if it wasn't documented in all these military archives. But he was able to negotiate his own release and get his Nazi commanders to surrender themselves with promises of immunity that he really didn't have any ability or power to make. But he got them to lay down their arms at the end of the war when the US was concerned that was fearful that there would be a great last stand in the Austrian Alps by Hitler's men in 1945. So I got the chance to meet Freddie, and this would be a good time to maybe to show you some of the photos that I have. Let's just make sure the technology is all working here, or sharing screen. Okay, you should now be able to see yeah, okay. Is that you seeing the cover there of the book? Do you see that? Tim, is that visible? Okay, yes.
Yes, it's visible.
Thumbs up. Okay, so I went out to West Virginia and I met with Freddie. This is a picture that I took of Freddie at his house, 94 years old. He was still not only living by himself in rural West Virginia, but was driving a car. He was delivering Meals on Wheels, he said, to the younger folk who couldn't get around quite as well as him. He was even shoveling his own driveway and chopping his own wood. And we had this marvelous day together that, you know, I'll never forget, that you wish you could just sort of bottle up and preserve forever. And talking about his childhood growing up in Germany in really almost an idyllic setting before Hitler, as hard as that is to imagine now. We forget it was sort of a golden age for Jews and other minorities in the early 1900s, prior to the Nazis' seizure of power in 1933, and he really benefited from that. His father had his own business. His grandfather started his own synagogue in Freiburg, Germany, in the Bavarian sector, and he had really a quite a. I'll show you a photo as I talk about that. That's Freddie as a kid, and what I love about this photo, he's wearing there, as you see, a belt, and that is a military belt that his father had worn as a hero, an officer and a hero in World War I, fighting for Germany. And Freddie, as a kid, considered himself really more German than Jewish. He was German through and through. He dreamed of perhaps flying in the German military, you know, like the Red Baron. He ran around the house wearing this military belt and begging his father to tell him more war stories from the losing effort in World War I. So he told me these stories of his childhood. He, of course, told me the stories of the war and of his mission. And he even acted out for me the scenes of torture at the hands of the Nazis when they finally got their hands on him and actually waterboarded him. And he demonstrated for me how they hung him from a rafter of an interrogation room, you know, pouring water in his mouth, threatening to drown him, knocking his teeth out with a gun. He lost 6 of his teeth, and telling me these phenomenal stories and posing undercover. He imitated the French accent that he used for me when he posed as a French electrician in a munitions factory, and he changed his name only slightly in the pronunciation. He told me instead of Friedrich Meyer in Germany, he became Friedrich Meyer, and he just laughed hysterically as he recounted this 70 plus years later. And he seemed just so vibrant. I suppose I should have realized that at age 94, unfortunately, anything can happen. And just 3 months later, he passed away. And one of the last things I had said to him was that, you know, I would love the chance to write about your story, because it's a story that more people should know. The bravery, the hardships, the immigrant experience, the difficulties of getting into the United States. And he thought, like, there'd been some books written years before about missions like his, including his. There'd been some interviews that he'd done. He thought, enough was enough. He was sort of non-committal to it. I said, well, you think about it. And that was about the last thing that we said to each other when we said goodbye. And unfortunately, I wrote about him much more quickly than I expected, which was for an obituary in the Times, where I was still working then in the Washington Bureau. You see my byline there saying that Fred Mayer, who spied on Nazis after fleeing Germany, dies at 94. So that was a very bittersweet story for me to have to write much sooner than I had anticipated. But at least the chance to let people know, what he had done in the pages of the New York Times. But I realized right away that was not a story you could really do justice to in 800 words in the newspaper, and it deserved really a fuller treatment. So I decided I wanted to tell his life story, which is what I ended up doing. And let me read to you here from the prologue, maybe just a page or so before we go on with some of the photos, because I think this gives you a sense really of just the courage, the daring that it took to do what he did. And this begins, the prologue, in February 25th, 1945, airborne over the Austrian Alps. And it begins, the snow-capped Alpine mountains looked deceptively quiet, even peaceful, as Freddie Mayer, crouched in the back of a B-24, gazed down at the majestic peaks whizzing by in the frigid night air. Close your eyes and you could almost forget there was a brutal war being waged on the ground 10,000 feet below. Peering one last time through the narrow Joe hole on the floor of the plane's bomb bay, Freddie waited for the final signal from the cockpit. 7 years earlier, when Freddie had fled Nazi Germany as a teenager, a return trip to the hellfire Adolf Hitler had made of Europe would have seemed unthinkable. Yet here he was now at the age of 23, a parachute on his back and a bulky bag strapped to his leg with a pistol, ammunition, and supplies inside it, preparing to dive back into the Nazis' stronghold in Austria. And he was doing it for the Americans, no less, on an improbable spy mission aimed at thwarting Hitler's feared last stand in the Alps. This was the life on a tightrope adventure that the barrel-chested refugee had been craving for months, pitting him against men he had once called countrymen. Somewhere below him, unseen among the rugged mountain terrain, were Nazi soldiers armed with anti-aircraft weaponry designed to shoot down planes just like this one. The chances of success for Freddie's tiny three-man spy team were 1 in 100, an officer told him glumly. That was good enough for Freddie, anything to defeat the fascists, he said. He had waited so long for this chance, and he was desperate to make the jump. The mission had already been scuttled twice in the last 5 days because of bad weather. And less than half an hour earlier, the flight crew had almost been forced to turn back yet again for Italy. Freddie was determined to make this the night. The moonlit skies that separated him from the Nazis on the ground below now looked calm, even inviting. Gorgeous, he thought to himself. An odd feeling of tranquility washed over him. The cockpit relayed the signal. Ready, 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 go, the crewman yelled. Seated at the edge of the Joe hole, Freddie pushed away and jumped. And I'll show you the Alpines that he jumped into. Forgive me for skipping around a little bit here in the presentation, but this is a photo from the wartime era. It was actually taken, I believe, a few years before the war, showing the peak of what was called the Sulztaler Glacier, about 13,000 feet above sea level. And that is roughly where Freddie was able to parachute into. And this was just the first step of what I called in the prologue there, this improbable mission that at every step, it's sort of remarkable that it did not fail and that he was able to survive. The first of many, many formidable challenges they faced was in retrieving the supplies that were sent down to them in canisters, in huge 50-gallon canisters. There were 3 men dropped. Two were really dropped, and the third man was a little less well and was really pushed because he froze up at the end. He wasn't sure he was going to go. But 3 men came down, and the canisters came after them. And among the containers were meals, what we would now call meals ready to eat for the military. They didn't call them that back then. Food for them. They had gold coins to bribe people. They had weapons, of course. They had maps, what limited maps they had of the area, of the towns, and of the provinces in and around Innsbruck, which is, of course, the capital of Tyrol. And they also had skis, because their assignment from the spy agency, from OSS, was to be dropped on this glacier and then to ski down to civilization, basically, outside Innsbruck, about 20 miles outside Innsbruck, where there was a series of little towns there. And among the men, among the three, was a man from this area who was an excellent skier. He was a Nazi turncoat. He had defected, and he was recruited for this mission by Freddie. I'll show you the picture of him here. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm out of order here. This is the Nazi spy, whose name was Franz Weber. He was an excellent skier. Freddie, on the other hand, had skied maybe once or twice in his life, but like everything, thought he could do it without a problem. So he told his supervisors in OSS that he was a great skier, even though he wasn't. The third guy, Hans, who was also the one who sort of froze up before they jumped out, was more candid with them and said, "I've never skied a day in my life. I have no idea what I'm doing." And they said, "Well, you'll learn on the way." The problem was that when they made it down to the glacier, the skis did not arrive with them. Some of them sailed probably over the Austrian Alps into Italy and might still be there today. And so they were short by 2 pairs of skis, which meant that Franz, the expert skier, was given the assignment of basically making a toboggan with the other set of skis, putting all the supplies on them and trying to find civilization, while Freddie and Hans kind of slid their way down to the next point of civilization, which was this cabin, which was usually used as a Nazi alpine lookout point by skiers, by Nazi patrol skiers. And I'm not going to go into all the details because I hope you read the book. So I want you to save a little bit of the suspense. But they did make it there. I mean, barely. Hans at one point was so exhausted from about 10 hours trudging through snow and so frostbitten that he told Freddie just to leave him there. And Freddie wouldn't do it. And somehow they made it. But they did make it down, and they made it down to the town below that, and the town below that, and the town below that, until they finally made it to Franz's original town in the town of Oberperfis. I'm sorry, I'm looking for there's a good shot of Freddie while we're talking about that. And that was where they set up their base with the cooperation of people that Franz, the local Austrian Nazi, had recruited to help them. These people, many of them women, in fact, who at incredible risk to themselves. Here you see one of them who owned a local inn in this town called Oberperfis, were willing to help these 3 American soldiers, one of them a former Nazi soldier, because unlike probably 95% of Austria, they did not like the Nazis or Hitler. Austria, of course, in the Anschluss had sort of opened with open arms, had welcomed in Hitler and the Nazis in a reunification, as they saw it. But they were among the small minority. Also among them was the local priest at the church, who also helped them at incredible risk to himself, a Catholic church. And she and another woman, who, like several women along the way, fell in love with Freddie and helped him, perhaps as much for romantic reasons as anything else, were critical to their mission. This woman named Mona had acted as just about every type of support role you could imagine for Freddie, as a lookout, as a courier to carry messages back and forth between Freddie and his radio man. The third man, who was, you see here, that was Hans on the left, a tall, lanky man. You can see, I love this photo because you see him looking at Freddie on the right there with such admiration. He idolized till the day they died. They were great friends and into their 90s. When Hans died, in fact, the day after he spoke with Freddie from across the Atlantic, he passed away, which his family thought was like he was ready to go after talking to Freddie, because he had come to just idolize everything about Freddie. Hans, I was privy to interviews that he gave years ago. He really downplayed his own role. He was sitting in an attic the whole time as the radio man. He became quite a noted scientist years after the war, and he was gifted in Morse code and radio operations. And he really downplayed his whole role in terms of saying, I was just sitting in an attic the whole time. He carved a chess set for himself to sort of pass the time and play games with himself for the better part of 6 weeks. He was in this attic. And of course, you or I or anyone else would think that's a fairly brave role itself, and the competency and ability to send those cables that Freddie was gathering onto U.S. intelligence people in Italy, in Northern Africa, in Washington, was critical for the mission. Freddie could gather everything he could, but without the ability to get it back to U.S. intelligence officials, obviously it was worthless. And here you see a picture of, I've mentioned OSS now a few times, the man behind OSS, the spy agency, which didn't even exist when Pearl Harbor was bombed, was General Donovan, known as Wild Bill Donovan, who realized that the U.S. spy capabilities were sorely lacking, both before and during the war. We were so far behind not only the Germans, but even our allies, the British and the French, in terms of intelligence gathering. He was determined to build a spy agency really from the ground up. And in fact, they took over a country club just a few miles from where I live in Bethesda, Maryland, and turned it into a training ground where Freddie, and that's a picture from the training ground in Bethesda, where Freddie and Hans trained for months and months, too long if you ask them. They wanted to go parachute in someplace instead of doing all this training, but they trained in this country club and with live ammunition for months and blew the hell out of the place, forgive my French, to the point that they destroyed the golf course and had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to the country club afterwards for all the damage that they left behind in their wake. I know I'm jumping around not just in photos, but chronologically, but this is a picture of Hans on the left with his twin brother on the right, who is still alive and who I had the chance to interview along with Freddie. Freddie passed away, but his twin brother is still alive. And this, I love this picture. It's of them who also got golden tickets to come to the US before the war, also ended up in Brooklyn, although he and Freddie didn't know each other there before, Hans and Freddie before they both enlisted. His story, though, was really more tragic because his father had the foresight to try and get his family out, family member by family member, to the United States. Because he saw the threat of the Nazis. He wasn't able to get visas for his entire family, Hans's father, and so he sent the two of them first, and then with the promise that they would follow later. And I had access to these heartbreaking letters that were written from the family back and forth to the twins in Brooklyn about this, the encroachment of the Nazis, and then eventually the invasion of the Nazis. And if I didn't say it, he was in the Netherlands. I think I left that out, I'm sorry. They lived in the Netherlands, and finally the invasion of the Netherlands, and the draconian measures that were being taken piece by piece in the Netherlands and throughout Europe under Nazi rule before the letters just stopped. And you could imagine they never made it. Hans never knew that for certain until after the war, until he went back to try and find them and found out that they had been sent to the camps. So unlike Freddie's family, who were able to come as a whole unit together, including even Freddie's grandparents, Hans lived out his life knowing that his parents and his grandparents and his little brother never made it out. So let me show you just a couple more photos, and then maybe we'll open it up for questions, because I think we're about half an hour in now. Here, I mentioned Freddie posing as the French electrician, as Frédéric Meyer. I took several trips to Austria in my research, so this is a photo that I took in 2018 during my research. This was where this munitions factory, an airplane factory, was and still stands now underground at this facility. And it was just one of several roles that Freddie took on undercover once he landed in Austria. Here, he was able to pose, as I said, as a French electrician, and to work on the assembly line where the Germans, again, at the tail end of the war, were making what they hoped would be one of their miracle weapons, designed as the fastest jet, really the only high-speed jet at that point, in the air by either side. And this was a real fear of the United States. They already had a limited number up in the air. There was a fear that they were going to be able to turn them out en masse in the hundreds, even thousands. And so Freddie wormed his way into this factory, posing as a French electrician, as a POW, and was able to determine, much to the relief of US commanders, that the assembly line had basically ground to a halt because they had run out of materials, of the metals and other materials that they needed to make these. And so he sent back very encouraging and very helpful intelligence that the Messerschmitt jets were essentially grounded. Before this, he had posed as a Nazi officer, as a wounded Nazi officer, and talked his way, despite all the admonitions from his supervisors not to do this, talked his way into a rehab facility for wounded Nazi officers. And posing here, this is Freddie as a Nazi officer. He's wearing a Nazi uniform there. You can see, I can't quite point to it there, but you can see the Nazi eagle there on the left corner, bottom left corner, was able to gather a whole series of reports, the most remarkable being a night of drunken debauchery among the male officers at this rehab facility in the officers club, including an officer, an engineer who had just come back from Berlin after helping retrofit the Führer's bunker. And Freddie was able to join in this conversation in a listening mode, pretending again to be a wounded Nazi officer with bandages on his head and his shoulder, and to cable back through Hans in that attic in Oberpurfus this vital intelligence about what the Nazi engineers had done to safeguard the Führer in terms of new concrete walls and barricades, moving the location of the underground bunker. He had all the specifications scribbled down on a napkin and then cabled back through his girlfriend Mona there, and then through Hans back to the U.S. So you can imagine the delight with which they read this. This, after fearing for a time, once these guys land in the parachute, they hadn't heard from the U.S. intelligence officials, had not heard from the team for 4 or 5 days because they had such difficulty getting down. They had essentially written them off as dead. And so then for weeks and weeks to be receiving daily cables from Freddie and his team was considered by OSS to be the single most productive and invaluable mission by any OSS team at a time when many of the men who were sent down never made it out alive. You heard from the prologue, as I mentioned, the 1 in 100 chance of surviving. That wasn't just a number that was plucked out of thin air. That was based on the realization that they had sent teams down into Austria before, who had immediately been met by Nazi troopers who executed on the spot. They had sent teams into parts of France and Germany who were captured and were sent to concentration camps. They had tried to parachute guys down who had gotten tangled up in the wings of the plane and were smashed to their death against the plane. So when they said a 1 in 100 chance, if anything, that might have been overly optimistic. And so for Freddie and his small team, Franz and Hans, to be able to produce the kind of intelligence they did was remarkable. And they also gave credit, and credit was due to the members of the flight team. And I was lucky enough to meet the pilot of the plane, who took numerous trips. They, as I said in that prologue, they had to turn around 3 times, and then they got caught in this horrible windstorm where he thought he was going to crash. But the pilot is still alive. I interviewed him numerous times, a guy by the name of John Billings. He's now 98 years old, lives in rural Virginia, about 2 hours away. And believe it or not, this is true, he is still flying a plane. He flies for a program called Angel's Flight, which you may know if you're familiar with that. They do medical missions for people that need medical care, need to be transported to more sophisticated hospitals in Pittsburgh or Washington or wherever. And he jokes that he's fine. He has a much younger co-pilot who I think is about 70 now. But he flew a mission just a few months ago, just absolutely amazing. And he was even featured on, I think, ABC News on their Person of the Week a couple of months ago. So I was lucky to meet John, and he's still going strong. Freddie, unfortunately, as I said, passed away just a few months after I met him, but I feel incredibly lucky to have gotten the chance to meet him when I did, and to be able to get to know his story and hopefully pass it on to future generations. So I guess with that, I may have gone even a little longer than Tim had counted on there. So we can open it up and start wherever you want, Tim.
Sure, Eric. I have to tell you, in all honesty, that the book is written as if it were a novel. And for a while there, I was beginning to think that maybe you had made it up. But then finally, Freddie gets arrested, and the story seems to come back down to earth.
Yeah.
Folks, please either put your questions in chat, or if you would like to ask your question of Eric yourself, please just say, I have a question for Eric. And
I'm gonna leave the share mode now, so you can look at me instead of Freddie. That may be a bad trade-off, but we'll do what you think.
Thank you. Let me use the host prerogative to ask the first question. Eric, you've shared that you grew up in a Jewish household, I think. And did your background, what effect, if any, did your background have on your feelings as you worked on this book?
It certainly played some role. As growing up Jewish, certainly was aware of and just thunderstruck by the Holocaust, by the fact that it could happen. I remember when first seeing the images of that in my synagogue, and learning only later when I started to write about, first in the Nazis Next Door, and then in this book about the Holocaust. I learned that there's the Nazis Next Door. I learned in a way that I hadn't realized before that there was a silence around the Holocaust among the survivors, even among the U.S. military who went into the camps. that it wasn't really until the 1970s, when I was a kid, I think I was probably among the first generations exposed, that people began really talking about that. It was, for the survivors, it was almost shameful. They had this survivor's guilt. And in the 70s, you may remember, the big series was, it started the multi-part series was Roots, was of course the huge one. But then almost as big was a series called The Holocaust, which opened people's eyes to a lot of things. And I remember thinking back, I was that age when at my synagogue they showed, the pictures, those pictures that hadn't been shown before of, the bone-thin survivors at the gates. And those people that didn't start until the 70s, the 80s. And now we've had this incredible body of work that's been done in the last 30, 40 years. So to be a part of that as a Jew, as a journalist, as a bit of a historian, I guess, I felt compelled to do that. My own family, we did not, thank God, we did not lose anyone directly in the Holocaust. My family immigrated to Ellis Island in the late 1880s, as did many Jewish families. So we probably had distant relatives, but no one within the close family tree. But certainly I've met now, many people who lost immediate families. Just hearing, talking to Hans in the Netherlands, his family. Hans returned to the Netherlands after living in the United States for many years. He returned to the Netherlands, which was interesting. And so I've gotten to know his family. They shared those letters that I mentioned from his parents, who were ultimately killed. And, hearing those stories and realizing just the implications today in terms of refugees who were often shut out themselves from borders that are closed, seeing the parallels to the late 1930s and the Jews and the Romas and others, gays who were denied refugee status for so long, and so many who didn't make it. The rise of fascism. We are not. I want to be careful about drawing comparisons to Nazi Germany. No, we are not. This is not Nazi Germany, despite what some people might say. But the rise of sort of fascist thought and ideology and propaganda and misinformation is scary in a lot of ways. So to be able to write about that now in 2 books, and in my next book to look at neo-Nazis in the United States who somehow follow the lead of the real Third Reich, is important and interesting to me.
Great. Eleanor D'Amato asked if you could speak a little bit more about the sources that you use, and you mentioned that you did a couple of reporting trips to Austria. Could you talk about, who you were able to find there, and what were there any German documents that you were able to access to help tell the story?
Yes, is the answer to all those things. There were archival documents. There were some people who were still alive. I mentioned the pilot, who was the most critical, and I did meet Freddie for those 4 or 5 hours. So there were people, there were witnesses to all this who were still alive. Some of the most important archival document. Steven Spielberg, you may be familiar, did, it's still going on, a project called the Shoah Foundation that he created, which were interviews with thousands and thousands of survivors through USC and the Shoah Foundation. I think it's somewhere over 10,000, maybe even more than that. Long interviews. And Freddie was among those that was interviewed about 30 years ago. by a woman who I've become who was very helpful to me in Nevada, a Holocaust, a second generation survivor herself. And she interviewed Freddie in the 1980s, all of this on video, and that was invaluable to me. Not only his discussion of the mission itself, but of his childhood, which he had never really discussed. I talked about that a little with him when I met him, but this was much more in depth about growing up, as I mentioned, in a fairly, fairly middle upper class upbringing in Freiburg, Germany, only to see that collapse, be thrown out of school. His father essentially loses business under the Nuremberg laws, and then have to flee. So that was a great resource for me. There were military documents, interviews with the team members afterwards. There were several books that had been done in the 70s and 80s that included a number of OSS missions, including this one, and there were audio tapes from that research that I used. And then in my trip to Austria, I was lucky enough to connect with people in that town of Oberperfus that I mentioned, about 20 miles outside Innsbruck, who were quite well versed in this whole mission, and had collected archival documents themselves. There's a museum nearby that has some documents that were very helpful. In fact, I'll show you. I'll go back to the share screen here, and let's see here. Probably the highlight of that trip for me was where I got to go to the spot. This spot here. Let's go to the. All right. This is a shot I didn't show you before. Right after Germany surrendered in May of 1945, and as I mentioned, Freddie was able to not only negotiate his own release from capture. He had been held in a concentration camp, believe it or not far from Innsbruck for about a week. He not only negotiated his own release, but got the commandant, the top commander for the Tyrolean region to lay down his arms by making all sorts of promises that really he had no way of fulfilling. He was quite a bluffer, and he was able to then get a Jeep with a German Nazi escort to take him. At that point, it was about 15 miles outside the city of Innsbruck, where the frontline troops of what were General MacArthur's battalion were waiting for a possible invasion of Innsbruck from the troops behind them. And this seemed imminent. And Freddie drove out in a German Jeep, a Nazi Jeep, with a pillowcase tied to a pole. Again, you can't believe this stuff is true, except it's all documented. There's even Germans who talk about this in their German archives, with a surrender flag. And the men at the front line, just a small group sort of holding that front position, couldn't believe what they were seeing. And he reports that he even gave himself a promotion. He said, "This is Sergeant Mayor," because he was a little miffed that they hadn't promoted him before he parachuted in. Sergeant Mayor, and Tyrol has just surrendered. And you couldn't believe the look on the guy's eyes. And so this picture is wonderful for me because when I went back to Austria, one man in particular was sort of my local tour guide who become obsessed with the story of Fred Mayer. He didn't think that they had gotten the recognition that they deserved. In fact, Austria, had its tortured relationship with the Nazis, and really didn't want to acknowledge this mission for a long time. There were even people in town when I went there who, it was said, were not really all that happy that the Nazis lost, even in 2017. And Franz Weber, Hans and Franz, I gotta keep them straight. Franz on the left in the suit didn't he became a politician, didn't say anything about the fact that he worked with the US for, about 30 or 40 years after the war, because he knew that wouldn't help him. There were people who think, oh, you helped the US. Anyway, so there was this local tour guide who thought that these guys deserved far more recognition than they got within Austria. And he was taking me around. I wanted to see where Freddie had holed up in the attic. I wanted to see, and then I showed him this picture this is the same picture from the obituary that we ran in the New York Times. And I said, yeah, this is a picture of them right after the war, I think. His English wasn't great. He says, yeah, I know where that is. You want to go see that? I said, what? You know where that is? He said, yeah, that's about 2 miles from here. It's my friend Weber's backyard. And he takes me there. I don't have the picture of me, but I have a picture. Oh, I'm sorry. It's the picture on the back of this. No, let's see here. And I got to pose at that exact same spot as they were standing. That is the exact same spot. And I got chills just sort of standing there. And his friend, whose backyard that was, they made sure they brewed schnapps in their house. It was a very rural area. They had to give me a couple of shots of schnapps while I was there. And I started asking them, like, you know, do you have any of the things from that time? Because the person who lived there years ago was one of these people who secretly collaborated with the Americans at incredible peril. He used to be the mayor of the town until the Nazis threw him out. And this was his grandson who now lived there, who seemed completely disinterested, like really didn't care that his grandfather had done all these heroic things to help the Americans. And he's like, nah, I don't have anything. His English was even worse than his wife, I remember, sort of slapped him like, you idiot, there's that whole box of stuff. And he's like, what box of stuff? And she says, yeah, and she goes and she finds this whole box of stuff. And not only the box of stuff, she found one of the ski poles that they had. They wanted me to take it. I said, no, you should hold on to this. One of the ski poles that they had used to finally climb down, one of the ones that hadn't sailed over the other side of the Austrian Alps. And they had that just sitting around in their attic. So those were really memorable stories for me. And this is another shot from near where that photo was taken once the Americans had taken over. And you see just the incredible beauty and you know, what a sort of rugged terrain that was for the Americans.
Eric, we got lots more questions here.
Yeah,
so
go ahead. Go ahead, Tim. Yes.
Going.
Yes.
And I've got a couple of questions from Dana.
Sure.
And after Dana, I'm going to go to Jim Heaney. Jim, if you would share your screen and turn off your audio, you'll be next in line. But okay. Dana asked, did Freddie have a family later on? What happened to him?
He did. He got married and had 2 daughters who live in the U.S. He divorced not long afterwards, and he I think the mother, I think his wife went back to Europe. The daughters are still in the U.S., although I didn't have much to do with them. They didn't want to cooperate. I think they might have had their own project in mind. I'm not sure, to be honest. So there were other family members who I did find helpful, but the daughters didn't want to take part in the project, unfortunately, which is too bad. But he worked. He ended up because he was incredibly mechanical. Was a whiz with engines, with mechanics, and he ended up becoming an engineer for Voice of America after the war, and going all over Europe, including back to Germany and other and Asia and elsewhere, as a Voice of America engineer running the facilities.
Was Dana also asked, was Freddie disgusted that the U.S. allowed Nazis to continue in positions of power after the war because they were favoring the Nazis as a better alternative over the communists?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly, yes, was unhappy about some of the things that he saw. He had the chance to go back in as a spy. You know, he had done such a brilliant job for OSS that there was talk of bringing him back in the CIA. he didn't want to. That might have been perhaps because of his, displeasure with some of the politics after the war. I'm not certain, to be honest.
And my friend Jim Heaney has a question.
Can you hear me, Tim?
Yes.
Yes.
Here's my question. First of all, I want to leap on to Tim's comment about it reading like a novel. And as a fledgling writer, I'm curious how you moved from the facts to writing it in such a way that it was as if you were there.
Well, that's the trick. I mean, that's certainly what I set out to do, was to give you a feeling that, like, you're actually there in Freiburg, Germany as a boy, when he was a boy, or in Brooklyn, or in Austria when he's parachuting down. Luckily there was enough material to work with between written archives, some of these audio tapes I mentioned, some of the videotapes from the Shoah Foundation. There were certainly times when I was frustrated, like, I wish I was writing a particular scene, a moment in time. I wish I knew this, I wish I knew that, and I couldn't quite answer it. So worked with the material that I had, and tried to bring that really to life. That was my goal.
I have a second question. Have you optioned the book?
There's been interest from any number of people, but it has not been optioned, to my surprise and disappointment. I think it would make a great movie. There was, about 10 or 12 years ago, there was a documentary of sorts. It was sort of a quasi-documentary where before Freddie died, where he was, maybe it was more like 15 years ago, where he was interviewed, and they did sort of a fictionalized version of this, but there's not been an option yet on Return to the Reich. I mean, it would be.
I have an unsolicited suggestion of a father-son team that might do this. It's James Caan as the father, and his son Scott Caan, who is a short man, barrel-chested, and quite a character.
Huh. Okay. All right. James
Caan,
the actor James Caan.
And his son Scott Caan,
yeah. Okay,
is also an actor.
I will look into it. All right.
All right. Thanks for the Hollywood advice, Jim. Carolyn Finney asks, how come Freddie's medal was denied?
Well, the official reason was, ludicrous as it sounds, is that.
And by the way, Eric, would you mind stopping sharing screen?
Oh, sure.
So we can see everybody.
Yep. Hang on. Does that work?
Yep.
Okay.
That's good.
The official reason in the military bureaucracies was that basically spies were not eligible for the Medal of Honor. This was proposed, and I looked at all the documents back in 1946, and then it was proposed again in around 2010, 2011. So like 60 plus years later at that point, by J. Rockefeller, was then senator from West Virginia, where Freddie lived. And both times they got the answer that the Medal of Honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor, was considered to be only for combat soldiers. Now, it seems like a ridiculously narrow reading of it, because Freddie, was captured and tortured by the Nazis. He was confronted at gunpoint. He was in a combat situation, no doubt. There are those, his advocates, who think there might have been some anti-Semitism to it. Freddie always claimed that the medals didn't mean a lot to him. Although that picture I showed you earlier, he's standing in front of some of the lower, less high-profile medals he did get. So, I asked him about the Medal of Honor. He's like, it would be nice, but it's not a big deal. It wasn't. He really was quite humble, incredibly humble about his whole experience, and I think he would have liked the accolades, but he certainly didn't pursue it.
Eric, you mentioned you're working on a new book. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, sure. My new book is on a huge surge that we've had the last few years in hate crimes in America and around the world. Many of them carried out by white supremacists, the worst of the worst, mass murders in Pittsburgh at a synagogue there, in El Paso at the Walmart of 20 plus Hispanics, in Charlestown at a African American church, at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, all of those by white supremacists. And so the book will look at this political time that we're in, the rise in really violent extremism, and the belated efforts by law enforcement and intelligence officials to get their arms around this.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time. Eric, why don't you share screen one more time with a picture of the cover of the book?
Oh, sure. One sec.
So I can't tell you enough how much I recommend this book. It's a really easy read, and to boot, it's about one of the most critical times in our lives. So please give it a read. And Eric, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Oh, you're welcome.